Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We'll continue Some Obstructions to Self-Discovery, Complicated Grief and Guilt, The Story of Harry. Grief is a natural response to the loss of others and to the loss of oneself as one once was, or hoped to be. Grieving, the working through grief, is difficult but important in the aftermath of trauma, and the difficulty is often exacerbated by the complication of conscious or unconscious guilt. When, with or without guilt, grieving stalls, so does the life. Judith Herman suggests some important reasons the survivors of trauma cling to their symptoms. Symptoms may be a symbolic means of keeping faith with a lost person, a substitute for mourning, or an expression of unresolved guilt. In the absence of a socially meaningful form of testimony, many traumatized people choose to keep their symptoms. In the words of the war poet Wilfred Owen, "I confess I bring on what few war dreams I now have, entirely by willingly considering war of an evening. I have my duty to perform towards war." Harry first came to see me for therapy at the age of 58. Within a few minutes of meeting him, I sensed that he was authentically at ease in the world, without a suggestion of bluff or posturing. But 15 minutes later, I had another thought. Harry had the ease of a man who had given up, a man with no hopes or plans, a man who was at ease because he had nothing to lose. Then I had still another unspoken thought. Harry could really stand to lose some weight. He was corpulent, his gait and breathing were perceptibly labored, and he was otherwise obviously in poor health, which I would later find out was partly due to erratic medical attention to his HIV, and partly to his overly generous indulgence in fine food and wines. As I pondered Harry's poor health, it struck me that this man of ease was planning to die and had visibly implemented his plan to that end. Some people experience the prospect of death as a welcome certainty that unburdens emotional pain, and Harry seemed among them. I thought he might have come to talk about his death, but perhaps it was something else. Harry was a retired attorney who had spent his entire career in a public interest organization he had founded to legally represent socioeconomically disadvantaged medical patients. Many of his clients had HIV and were in disputes with medical and disability insurers. Despite his poor financial compensation for the work, he told me that he was happy with it because he had done a lot of good for people. He had received a substantial amount of money through family inheritance and was, by his own description, well off. But when he spoke about that, he clearly did it with discomfort. Harry lived alone, and though he had a small handful of friends, he led an almost completely isolated life in the Berkeley Hills, overlooking all of San Francisco Bay, including the city that he and his partner had lived in together for 15 years. The partner, also named Harry, though his given name was Harold rather than Henry, had died of HIV-related complications at the age of 39, 17 years before Harry and I first met. Harry suggested, for the sake of clarity, that we refer to his former partner as Harry II. The two had met when Harry was 26, and Harry II was 24, and Harry II had been Harry's only sustained relationship. Harry II was the only one I really cared about. I loved him more than anything in life. When I later asked Harry why he had come to see me, he simply said, "I really ought to have someone to talk to." Although he did not say it, it soon became apparent that Harry was not only lonely, but markedly depressed. It was the kind of quiet, easygoing depression that calls little attention to itself, the kind of depression that could easily be mistaken for a state of peace and enlightenment. Harry appeared to accept this state of being, though he attempted to medicate both it and his loneliness with his food, and particularly his wine. He acknowledged feeling chronic sadness, but rejected the thought of being depressed, a word he always spoke in quotation marks. But sadness alone does not entail some features our talks would clearly reveal: profound grief and guilt, chronic insomnia, almost complete isolation, and a nearly complete loss of interest in everything but eating and drinking. What we called it was of no importance, so we called it sadness. Harry did have some fear of becoming depressed, which was, he said, also part of why he had sought me out. He was concerned that any sadness he did acknowledge would place too much expectation on the few friends he had left, and he did not want to burden them. People, he said softly, have their own things to deal with, and the last thing they need is me. For heaven's sake, look at me. I'm old, I'm fat, I'm a mess. I'm completely tainted. In addition to the obvious aftermath of his traumatic experience with the early epidemic, Harry was clearly having feelings about other issues, including aging, but he seemed to have his feelings about aging entangled in feelings about the many he had lost to HIV in their youth. Perhaps he felt that if he had somehow magically held on to his youth, he would have been able to hold on to them, for as he aged, they remained forever young and felt increasingly distant. His attempt to hold on to those young men was keeping Harry attached to his grief, which obstructed any grieving that might allow him to move forward. As I pondered this further, I also thought that his feelings about aging were entangled in feelings about having HIV. Tainted is not a term we normally associate with aging, but it does suggest the feeling of being contaminated, which is relatively common, if often unconscious, among HIV-positive men. And finally, there seemed to be another issue that Harry was entangled in, something from his early life experience or family history, all of which he would steadfastly refuse to discuss until much later in our work. He did slip one day, saying that he had done to Harry too exactly what I did to my mother. "What does that mean?" I asked. Harry responded by shooting me a sharp warning glance and falling into total silence. "Well, we don't have to talk about it." Harry shrugged dismissively, as if there were never anything to talk about. Even as he denigrated himself and self-protectively foiled much of our work, I found Harry sympathetic, likable, and intelligent, and I wanted to be helpful. His adult history revealed that he had at one time led a generous, gregarious social life, with many close and intimate friends. They all died, well, almost all of them, he told me, matter-of-factly, not long after we first met. Harry and Harry too had lived together in San Francisco during the entire early epidemic, but Harry only rarely talked with anyone about that time, and in our conversations, he was reluctant to accept the influence of the epidemic in his current unhappy and isolated life. Forget his childhood and family. When I once suggested that the losses he had experienced in the epidemic were contributing significantly to his sadness, he looked surprised. So many years later? I'm not sure I see the connection. Over the first few months of our meetings, I realized that Harry lived with a nearly complete catalog of the feelings that obstruct the talking through and working through of grief. Harry had been unable to grieve almost everything that had transpired in his life, including, I speculated to myself, his unmentionable childhood. An accomplished and fundamentally gregarious man had, perfunctory and unsatisfying social events aside, been sitting home alone for the better part of 2 decades, drinking wine and eating too much. Even with the undefined specter of his childhood and adolescence lurking around the edges of our conversation, we would, I hoped, be able to untangle this emotional stalemate and set Harry partially free. Some traumas and losses are ultimately ungrievable, but I suspect Harry had enough resilience to allow a happier life. He would, I thought, never have closure or anything like it, for his losses had been too great, and survivors of true trauma rarely if ever have authentic, complete closure. But he could have a better resolution than he had. He could reconstruct himself around the inescapable facts of what had happened, which is an important kind of resolution because it allows a sense of personal wholeness. I hope that would be true for Harry, and I tangentially introduced the topic. It would quickly become clear that Harry's expectation of complete closure, which also seemed impossible to him, was one of the important obstructions to any act of grieving. Why work towards something when you already know it is impossible? Harry, when you talk about your life now, I often have the feeling that it is over or nearly so, that you are living as if you were in the last paragraph of a soon-to-be finished novel. Harry seemed surprised by my comment and had to think about it before he responded. Well, it is more or less over, isn't it? Perhaps the way you're living it now. But why are you living it this way? I've lived it. What else do I want? I'm nearly 60. Well, you've lived the part you lived, but what about the next decade or 2 or 3? You could live to be 87, no? Probably not if I keep eating and drinking the way I do. Maybe not, which suggests one possible motivation to eat and drink as you do. If I wanted to kill myself, I could think of better ways to do it and get it over with. I've thought of them many times. Please don't call the police. I'd guess that your chosen way, the eating and drinking, is a compromise that expresses some ambivalence. Ambivalence about what? About having a life or not having one. Well, I've already said that I think it's over. I'm still alive. I know, but I'm pretty sure it's not going anywhere. If you were completely convinced of that, if that were all you hoped for, I don't think you would have come to see me. I think you'd have just stayed at home. I think you're ambivalent. Can't we just talk without an agenda? I know that there's a lot that's happened to me, but we are not going to fix that. Fix? Fix what? The whole thing. The whole epidemic. Harry, our friends, the whole thing. We're not just going to fix that. No. I'm sure we're not going to fix it, but our talking might allow the beginning of a change in how you experience it. And what would we change if I went along with this? Maybe the grief that you live in, finding a way for you to live less in it. You call it sadness, but it is more than that. It's grief. You seem to me to be living deeply in grief without being able to mourn any of it. Harry became angry for the first time in my experience, and his sudden fury startled me. Do you really think that I'm going to move on from Harry's passing, from all of that, from all the others, from the horror of all that? Do you really think that I could or would do that? Do you think I would pretend that none of that happened or mattered? Do you think I would do that? You are very angry. About what? I feel furious. The idea that I would get over this. Harry, I didn't say anything about moving on or getting over it. And I'm not talking about pretending about anything. I was suggesting the possibility of some better way to not get over it, to not live completely stuck in it. That's not getting over it. It's more of a kind of accommodation. Right now, your life seems mostly about grief. To not feel completely stuck in that grief is one of the reasons I think you drink as much as you do. I can imagine drinking offers a lot of relief. A minute ago, you asked if I thought you could or would get over it. I think you're ambivalent about both the possibility and your desire to get over it. These are two different questions, but one influences the other. What you're feeling is confusing, and we'll both have to think more about it. Harry gave this a moment of thought. If you asked me what I really wanted, I would say I'd like to close the book on the whole thing. Find closure is what old friends used to say to me. People expect me to have closure, and it's one of the reasons I'm so alone now. A formerly close friend once said to me, Harry, it's like you're in permanent homage to the epidemic, and it's over. People can't stand to be around me. Well, it's not over, is it? Your feelings are not over. You still have HIV, which you're not taking very good care of. And anyway, it's all ongoing. People just aren't talking about it. In any case, I don't think you'll have closure on something like this, and I can't imagine why anyone would expect that, except that they don't want to think about it. And when you do, it's emotionally provocative for them. For right now, for you, I'll stick with the idea of accommodation. That would be a big improvement, a very big chance in your life. I'm talking about some grieving of what's happened, not closure. Harry glanced at the clock on the end table. It's time to stop. It's past time. He stood up, said goodbye, and walked out of the room. Harry phoned in sick to cancel our next appointment, and then 2 days after that, he called again to say that he would be in the following week. He also wondered if there was any way we could meet regularly twice a week. There was, and we started doing that. When Harry appeared for our first appointment for the following week, he sat down in his chair, started crying, and cried for many minutes. "Can you tell me what's going on?" I asked. "I was sitting out on the deck the other night, drinking, in case you want to know, staring at the scene of the crime, and started crying, and coming in here brought it all up again." "And what is the scene of the crime?" "The city, San Francisco, our city of light." "And the crime?" "You know the crime. Harry died. I got HIV. Everyone else died. And I guess I didn't die. The crime I know you know about. The crime you've written about. The whole fucking city of crime twinkling away in the dark. It's striking me that you moved to your house to get away from San Francisco, but now you sit and stare at it." "I used to all the time, mostly at night after work. Not much now, but what we talked about last time brought it up again. For several years after I moved into the house, I would stare at the city and imagine that I'd be able to see Harry walking down the street like he always did, from 10 miles away, no less. I'd imagine it the way it was before the crime, that Harry and I were on our way to the bar, and that Harry was skipping, which is how he walked, and I'd skip after him, and we'd run into friends, and they'd come with us. We were in some kind of naive heaven. It's long gone. Yes, Harry. Yes, Harry died a long time ago. And I didn't." "Yes, and that's the second time you've said that today." "I don't want to forget Harry." "I'm almost sure you never will." "But isn't that what you were suggesting last time? Get over Harry, find closure, stop drinking?" "I don't think I said anything at all about stopping drinking, and I rejected the idea of closure. And no, not forgetting, not getting over Harry. It's something more like integrating Harry's death, all the deaths, into your emotional life in a way that they didn't dictate your life. You partly accepted the fact of these deaths when you stopped looking at the city from your deck, when you stopped looking for Harry on the street. But at the same time, maybe you also tried to bury the memory of the facts. I'm not sure. I feel that if I stopped thinking about Harry, I would just lose him again. That it's better to have him like this instead of not having him at all. I feel like I'll lose myself if I lose him. And all the others too. Around the time I stopped sitting on the deck, staring at the city every night, I think I started drinking more. And that's when my IBS started, too. You'd given up hope of seeing him from the deck, of seeing him at all. I imagine you were experiencing his loss more intensely. That must have motivated the drinking, too. Harry nodded yes, and then seemed to be pondering something. But there's something else. Sitting on the deck was what I thought of as my time with Harry. And when I stopped that, as you said, I lost him. But I also abandoned him. I abandoned him the way I abandoned my mother. I remember thinking that Harry would be hurt if he didn't see me on the deck. And he would be angry. I was being disrespectful, as if I were saying to him, "You never meant much to me, or you don't mean much to me now, and I'm going to forget about you." And the thought of saying anything like that to Harry was unbearable. "And yet you stopped sitting on the deck," I pointed out, without appearing to notice Harry's first voluntary mention of his mother. "Well, I stopped sitting there because he wasn't showing up for our date. I'd sit there and stare, and no Harry. San Francisco became for me. That's when it became the scene of the crime. I never go to the city anymore. I can't. I'm afraid of having panic attacks on the bridge." "Have you had panic attacks on the bridge?" "No." "Have you ever had a panic attack?" "When I realized that Harry was actually dying, yes, then I had several. They had me taking Xanax every day." Going to San Francisco would confirm that Harry is no longer alive. He wouldn't be there. It would be the feeling of loss all over again. But is there also something else? Like what? I don't know. Some anger at Harry? "Well, I'm certainly pissed off at all these people for dying." Harry was silent for a moment. "And for some reason, right now I'm thinking that I have the right to be alive, and fuck them if they don't like it. Fuck them. If I feel like showing up in the city, then fuck them." "Fuck who?" "All of them. All the people who have died?" "Yes, all of them, including my mother." Harry seemed startled by what he had said and pondered it for a few moments. "But why am I suddenly angry about this?" "You sound as if you're angry because they don't feel that you should be alive, that they don't want to see you in the city. Do you feel that you have betrayed them, that you are being disloyal just for being alive? Do you feel this about your friends and your mother, whom you've mentioned twice today?" Harry looked startled again and started sobbing again, and I remained silent through the end of the hour. As Harry left the office, he said, "Thank you for listening to me today." "You're welcome," I said. I had borne witness to Harry's grief, guilt, and anger, and he had no one else to do that. More than simply needing someone to talk to, Harry wanted and needed someone to bear witness to what he had lived through and what he was still feeling about that experience. As we continued over the following months, Harry became more willing to discuss his parents. He had been raised as the only child in a wealthy Upper East Side Manhattan family, with an angry, taunting father who seemed perpetually disappointed in Harry. It wasn't only my life, it was who I was that disappointed him, and he always let me know that. In Harry's words, his mother was well-intended and relatively loving with him, but too unsure and frightened to assert herself in either the marriage or in protecting Harry from his father's emotional and occasionally physical abuse. That abuse was, to no surprise, badly exacerbated by Harry's coming out during dinner at the age of 15, which gave his father the opportunity to hurl several pieces of his wife's heirloom china at the dining room walls. Harry's mother was passively accepting of his being gay, but she was too trapped in her contentious and unhappy marriage to offer Harry much support or love. She always called him sweetheart, but that was about as far as it went. According to Harry, and the night he came out at dinner, the only upset she voiced to either Harry or her husband was about her grandmother's limages plates, which were part of a setting, she said, for 24. She tried to be a mother, but she was depressed, Harry said, as if suddenly concerned he was being unfair to her. Depressed? You sound as if you feel the need to protect her. She once told me that Beethoven was the most important man who had ever lived, that life without him would have been a lot worse. But was she depressed, despite Beethoven? She spent a lot of her time in bed, very depressed, and I knew that. But she was all I had, and there was nothing I could ever do that made things better. When I decided to go live in San Francisco, I knew that I was leaving her behind in a life she hated, and I felt a lot of guilt. I felt all that guilt again when Harry and I got together, because with Harry, I had something she never had. She knew that, and she knew I would never come home again because my father would never allow me to bring Harry. And then on top of it, she left me all that money. She left you the money upon her death? You said a while ago that she had died, but that was the first time I'd heard of that. Yes, her estate, which was separate from my father's, went to me. She died 2 years after Harry and I got together, almost to the day, and we were both silent for several minutes. And what? I finally asked. I already know what you're thinking. It's about Harry and my mother. What am I thinking about them? I can't say it without crying again. Well, say it and cry, if you can. I can't. Oh, it's about abandoning both of them. Leaving them to their fates. It was a horrible thing to do. I don't know if I can forgive myself for that because it's completely ridiculous. But I feel like I killed them. Then Harry did start crying. I said earlier that Harry embodied a nearly complete catalog of feelings that obstruct grieving, and guilt was a significant part of that catalog. Guilt about both his mother and Harry too had been working in destructive synergy to prevent the grieving he needed. Harry had a lot to grieve: his childhood of abuse and neglect, the loss of his mother, the loss of Harry too, and the life they had known together, the loss of innumerable others to HIV, and the loss of his youth to his own HIV. When I first met Harry, he lived without any sense of a personal future, and I felt his life had been swallowed whole by the unexamined, undigested trauma of all that experience. Robert J. Lifton describes people who have lived immersed in multiple deaths, and the difficulty they have in absorbing the losses and working through the grief. He might as well have been talking about Harry. This subordinate mourning can proceed to the extent that the survivor's existence can turn into a life of grief. Impaired mourning becomes equated with a more general inability to give inner form, again significance, to the death immersion, and therefore to the remainder of one's life. The survivors may then be especially vulnerable to various kinds of psychic and bodily disturbance, as well as to psychological formulations of their experience. Unresolved, incomplete mourning results in stasis and entrapment in the traumatic process. Harry first came to see me in the hope that our meetings would provide a substitute for a social life, and thus an end to his loneliness, all without having to actively grieve. By numbing his feelings, Harry's drinking had reduced his emotional pain, but it also had its downsides. It assisted his denial of grief and thus obstructed grieving. It posed probable health risks, and it brought up considerable shame. Both the drinking and the shame about it had kept him more firmly locked in his isolation, which was itself yet another obstruction to grieving. But the obstructions felt to Harry as if they also had an upside. In his guilt, Harry felt that any effort to work through his grief for a better life was a statement of unacceptable disloyalty to those he had loved. So two feelings, his abhorrence of disloyalty and his fear of having to relive and re-examine his losses, made a successful grieving process a forbidden and ominous task. Drinking was one way to give that task wide berth. As Harry's denial about his grieving and guilt slowly lifted over time, he increasingly accepted the idea that his feelings were worth talking about. One day we had a brief but important conversation that helped. I often think, what's the point? Harry said to me out of the blue. I thought I knew what he meant, but I wanted him to tell me. The point of what? The point of anything. Is there any point in talking about this? I asked. I don't know. I'm afraid that talking too much might keep me alive. There's your ambivalence again. I suppose that ambivalence about being alive has become my biggest strength. I think your ambivalence about being alive is very much about the fact that you're here and Harry too is not. We'll never change that. Talking, of course, is something else I'm ambivalent about. I'm afraid that if we talk too much, I'll come to acceptance of that fact, and I'm afraid that if we don't talk, it will all be moot. And as I am saying this to you, all I'm thinking about is going home and having a drink. Is that what you'll do? No, I won't. I want to sit and think about what you just said. Actually think about it. Harry felt, not thought, that his survival was a betrayal of those who had died, an expression of survivor guilt. He felt disloyal simply for being alive, and to make matters worse, he was not only alive, he was fortunate. He had money, he could buy as much wine and cheese as he liked, and he lived without pragmatic worry in a house on a hill with a commanding view. All of this good fortune had come from his mother, who had herself been deprived of another of Harry's good fortunes. He had been in love with a man and lived with him for a happy 15 years. Not even his obviously involuntary, undesired aging was guilt-free. For Harry once told me that in growing older, he was moving on and leaving Harry too behind, forever frozen in his youth. In addition to these personal sources of guilt, there was another that is routine, if not universal, in the lives of young gay men. In his early years, Harry had lived for 2 decades with guilt and shame about being gay, and thus a disappointment to his neglected family of narrow perceptions. With guilt stretching back to early childhood, Harry had intuitively drawn on it to sustain the stalled and unhappy aftermath of his later life trauma. The aftermath of Harry's aftermath. For Harry, the synergy between the traumatized childhood and the trauma of the early epidemic had been crushing, and he had lived for nearly 2 decades, perched on a hilltop, as if he were the only human survivor on Earth. He was not feeling good about most of that life, and his only solace lay in his fantasies of seeing Harry too from the deck, his carefully tended rhododendrons, and the Beethoven quartets he fell asleep to almost every night. Having relaxed his tenacious denial of the significance his childhood and the epidemic held for him, Harry was able, over more than 2 years, to put together a reasonably coherent story of his personal history. With that story in mind, he could more fully experience and interpret his feelings and make some sense of how his life had come to be what it was, and how it might be different. He had, in the words of Judith Herman, reconstructed a coherent system of meaning and belief that encompasses the story of trauma. For the first time since Harry II's death, Harry had begun to find a way to live a life that acknowledged the emotional legacy of his childhood and the epidemic without existing entirely in it. Harry slowly reestablished some of his old relationships, which meant driving over the bridge to San Francisco, and they again became meaningful to him. He improved his physical health by adhering to an HIV treatment regimen and better, if still less than stellar, eating habits. and he slowly reduced his drinking to levels that did not impair or isolate him. Harry was still not without ambivalence about whether there's a point, but he had made a clear shift in the balance of doubt. He had been able to incorporate his history into his current life and, once again, took some pleasure in life beyond the tripartite solace that had fortunately, if inadequately, tethered him for so many years. Judith Herman speaks of a survivor of rape and sexual abuse, but she perfectly describes Harry. The survivor who has accomplished her recovery faces life with few illusions, but often with gratitude. Her view of life may be tragic, but for that very reason she has learned to cherish laughter. She has a clear sense of what is important and what is not. Having encountered evil, she knows how to cling to what is good. Having encountered the fear of death, she knows how to celebrate life. Harry would never again be a young man skipping with his lover down the street of San Francisco, and he would never be who he might have been had his early life trauma and the epidemic never happened. But he had reconstructed his life into something that mattered to him. He had really survived. To this day, Harry occasionally calls to make an appointment for a session or two, to talk about this or that. Now his phone messages always start with, "Walt, it's Harry 1. Our convention had always been Harry and Harry 2, so Harry 1 was something new. What I sensed in the new moniker was a man who was finally able to consciously experience and accept both the love and traumatic loss of Harry 2. People who have deeply known and loved become part of who we are, and unless we forbid the feelings, we never completely lose them. Together, Harry and Harry 2 had become Harry 1, an authentic integration of a past with a present that had been impossible in the emotionally numbed, internally fragmented life that Harry had been living when I first met him. Harry is, once again, relatively whole. When I return Harry's calls now, I usually say, "Harry 1, it's Walt," and when I do, he laughs. What about Harry's drinking? When I first met him, Harry had a significant attachment to his wine, and it made our work more difficult. Substance use is elevated among gay men, as it is in most disadvantaged, stigmatized, and traumatized communities. Substance use, which is now often indiscriminately referred to as substance abuse, is usually treated as a problem of addiction. Addiction has become a common primary diagnosis for not only imbibed or injected substances, but for sex, the internet, shopping, and smartphones. Addiction seems to have become an apt description for any activity that someone engages in more often than he or others feel he ought to. Steeped in the idea of addiction as a diagnosis that identifies the primary issue, many psychotherapists today would not have accepted Harry for therapy until he cleaned up. That would have been a mistake and a damaging disservice to Harry. With me, he was straightforward about his drinking. He was not intoxicated during sessions, which would have seriously interfered with the work, and we were able to usefully address other issues, the true primary issues that lay behind the drinking. Applied to purely behavioral issues such as sex, the internet, and shopping, the use of the term addiction is a misleading metaphor. Sex and other behaviors may become compulsive, but they are never addictive, and the distinction between an addiction and a compulsion is important. In its original medical use, an addiction described a distinctive biological process, a cellular response and adaptation to a substance, the development of physiological tolerance, a need for escalating dosages to maintain the effect, and cellular renormalization, craving, and other withdrawal symptoms on abrupt cessation of use. While many substances initiate this biological process, many others do not. Behavior never does. Even when the substance is biologically addictive, addiction often remains an inadequate primary diagnosis. particularly if psychological insight is the objective. As discussed earlier in this chapter, such diagnostic labeling too easily leads to the idea that giving a name to signs, symptoms, or behavior provides explanation or insight. The spacious diagnosis of addiction supports the popular idea that the substance use or behavior is the fundamental issue, and that the diagnostic label is the name of something that the person has, often a disease or disorder. In that construction of human experience, the cure is to stop the use or behavior. Harry's drinking was psychologically motivated and it provided a lot of benefit. He had not been able to find another way to contain his grief and guilt, and the alcohol assisted the psychic numbing that protected him from seemingly unbearable pain. The alcohol may also have forestalled his consideration of a more succinct approach to suicide, even as alcohol sometimes helps implement that act. At home and more or less drunk a great deal of the time, Harry had only three things keeping him tethered to life, but alcohol was also contributing to his destructive isolation and, most likely, to his poor health and to an earlier than necessary death. The drinking might also have been elevating, rather than lessening, the suicide risk, a thought I discussed with Harry on several occasions. Alcohol is a mood depressant, but it often elevates impulsivity, and many suicides are initiated on impulse. All of these secondary problems made drinking an impossible longer-term solution. Even with the considerable risks, Harry's drinking was keeping him afloat, and he knew it. To stop drinking, he would have to convincingly feel at least the glimmer of an alternative, and in our early work together, I routinely acknowledged the benefits. My useful role was not to try to convince Harry that he ought to be interested in the longer term. I could only encourage him to stay connected for right now, so that we could investigate the issue, and he could answer the question for himself. There are things, I said early on in our work, that I think could be clarified that might allow you to feel different about your life. Harry knew the shortcoming of the drinking solution and hardly needed a reminder, and my acknowledgement of the benefits allowed him to feel heard and understood. Shortly after our first meeting, Harry had said to me, "I knew I had to tell you about the drinking, and I thought that, when I did, you'd throw me out the door like most of my friends have. I'm glad you didn't." My only early requests of Harry were that, for the sake of productivity, he show up at our meetings sober, and that he talk to me if he had defined suicidal thoughts. He never drank on the nights before our meetings, and the supportive regularity of our relationship had pushed suicide further from his mind. Early in the work, I did once remind Harry that alcohol was a central nervous system depressant, and that CNS depressants support what Harry and I had agreed to call sadness. Only over time did I also introduce two other ideas about drinking, both related to psychic numbing. The first was that alcohol induces a physiological rather than trauma-induced numbing, and that regardless of its origins, numbing interferes with the work of talking through issues because it makes one less conscious of one's feelings. The second was that numbing supports disconnection from others and isolation, which deepens feelings of loss and grief. Altogether, it's quite a litany you've got there, Harry commented, and for a long time, he kept drinking. He could not imagine tolerating his internal life without it, and he might have been right. It might have been intolerable. Before Harry could stop drinking, we needed to find insight about why he drank as he did, insight that might reveal a glimmer of credible hope for a different kind of future.